It is September 20 of 2014. I want to take a look at Spinoza's Tractatus in a very brief lecture. We want to keep it under 30 minutes if we can. And really, we just need to understand that it's situated between his logic and his ethics. And there's been a lot of confusion at this point, but all he really wants to do in the Tractatus is not so much present a full-blown hermeneutic as convey to his audience that the providence of divinity, the providence of the divine, is a necessity. It's because everything emanates from the one substance, including all of the attributes and all of the modalities. So it's a system of necessity. Our job is to articulate that providence as a necessity, not a contingency, and not something that's supposed to be confused with superstition and false metaphysics, but to simply articulate it as a true providence of necessity as an emanating singular substance. So it's going to serve the ethics. That's the whole purpose of this book, is to serve his upcoming ethics, which is going to be a consolidation of his entire system, but it builds on the book that he already had out there on his logic. His logic was in 1661, The Logic of Man and Well-Being. And then this book came along in 1669. And then the Ethics came along in 1677. Each book was interrupted by a pause of 8 years. So every 8 years he put out a major work. This is the middle work of his Tractatus, and it addresses the concept of necessity, and it negates the concept of superstition. So to look at this just briefly and to try to capture it in view of the structure of the ethics and the logic, first of all, he tells us that we will be involved in some negations. He wants to negate the idea of superstition, which is always suspended between a person's hope and fear, and usually trapped in an individual who is centered on a desire for things rather than that epistemological love of God that Spinoza says we need to seek. We need to negate the instability of the passions, including a religion that is simply adorned by pomp and ceremony, and get back to the true quest for gnosis and Sophia wisdom in that epistemological love of God. And we are to unveil all of our prejudices about religion, all of those assumptions about sovereignty that we had before that confused our thought with these extreme versions of a doctrine of the will of God, which Spinoza says is ridiculous. It's really sovereignty is addressed under the concept of necessity, not under the concept of volition. And then finally, we're to criticize all of the current deteriorations where the religion of love has deteriorated into these examples of hatred that have surfaced. Servitude has become creating careers of wealth and prestige, and faith becomes based on greed and ambition, and church is becoming more of a theater than really becoming a church. So very much his criticisms are very much in tune with what's happening today in 2014. Not simply in his day in the 17th century. We see the same thing today. So we need to be critical of those deteriorations of the organized church, get back to that epistemological love of God, and through that epistemological love and that quest for a true unveiling of the necessity of substance, of the eternal substance, we will unveil the true concept of providence, and we will do that by investigating the narrations, Spinoza says, the narratives that are given to us in the scriptures, and then by dialectically being involved in our own personal social history. So social dialectic coupled with biblical hermeneutic is going to yield an unveiling of the necessity of providence. Okay, social dialectic, biblical hermeneutic combine to unveil the true necessity aspect of divine providence or infinite providence. So it begins with the what he had discussed before in the 6 instruments of his logic. Well, he says that when we begin here, we're going to begin actually with an existing written document already in existence. So we begin with already an exscribed 5th instrument of the posited functional signs as the current possession we have of parables and prophecy. So we already possess exscriptions of parable and prophecy, and from those narratives we acquire the clear and distinct ideas that takes place within our current context. And we're concerned with an interpretation of the notion of extension, which to Spinoza equals the nature of God, and it speaks to us at the level of psyche rather than conceptualization. So these narratives that we have, that we work with, are visions coupled with language, and they are articulated, we perceive them as having been articulated through the work of imagination, and it addresses us at the level of psyche rather than cogito. The content of these written narratives are metaphorically to be understood as the spirit of the divine, Spirit of God. They're received from a prophetic voice of extraordinary virtue expressing the mind of God. And remember that the mind of God for Spinoza is the notion of extension. And it's an example of prophetic imagination. And it's the prophet exscribing that which has been inscribed in his own heart, his own psyche. It's an example of counterblow. This is prophecy beyond concept. It's expressed in functional signs and parable image, and not conceptual dogma. So the written narratives we have are sign-type narratives that point beyond their literal meaning. They are functional signs, or we could say functional sign narratives. And these functional sign narratives point to the notion of extension of substance, which is the mind of the divine. And they're not literal dogma. It is a narrative of logos. It assists us in acquiring our own clear and distinct ideas within our own current situation. And it is an example of a current written articulation of the divine notion of extension. That will work in tandem with our own natural knowledge and our own acquisition of the clear and distinct ideas in our history. So we are involved at the level of perception of having written documentation in hand. Parable from the New Testament, prophecy from the Old Testament, and they are imaginative sign-type narratives, not literal dogma. And those signs of meaning point to the historical author's own interpretation of the notion of extension. We couple that with our own apprehension at this level of psyche of acquiring those very first clear and distinct ideas of the primary attributes that make up the notion of the extension of substance. Because remember, in his ethics, the first step is to unveil the primary attributes of the divine that are hidden in the modalities of existence that we envision within our own situation. So we're in a process of unveiling these primary attributes. The narratives assist us, but they assist us in their sign-like quality of pointing, not in their literal determination. So we move on from there to partitioning, because even in the area of these narratives, we will get involved in some partitioning, not just in our external history where we partition away those primary attributes that are being unveiled, but with regard to the narratives, we are going to recognize there's a subjective temperament of the prophet that's involved, of the New Testament writer that's involved, at an emotional, cognitive, imaginative, and verbal eloquence level. There are subjective elements that are a part of this message, and we need to screen those out or peel away the outer layer to get to the charisma of the truth of those narratives and the truth of the signs and their pointing. So we partition away the true charisma message within these narratives, and we do that through the practice of philosophical reasoning according to Spinoza. And so we do enlist philosophical reasoning even at the level of psyche, and the goal that we have is to partition away the existential being that is present in the historical narrative. We're looking at historical narratives. They're conveying existential truth, truth of being, truth of the I am. We want to partition away the existential truth in order to reach the primary attributes that are being pointed toward, in order to couple with the work we're currently involved in acquiring the clear, distinct primary attributes that are being witnessed in our own situation. So we are involved in this work of partitioning. That takes us to dialogue at the level of psyche to help refine the existential truth of narrative in prophecy and narrative in parable. And when we discuss this in dialogue, Spinoza says we keep centered in our mind the goal to unveil fade, F-A-D-E. We want to unveil fade. That is, we want to unveil the aspects of fortune, assistance, direction, and election. Fortune, assistance, direction, and election. And these are 4 categories that will help us discover major concepts, primary concepts. And fortune is going to be the unforeseen causes of existential being within narrative and within our history. Assistance is any cause that contributes to the preservation of the being of the individual or the preservation of the being of the community. Direction is the interrelated form present in the natural order of our history and the interrelatedness in our social community. Those are all aspects of the direction of the one eternal substance. And election is any persuasive summons that we feel to participate, or we're persuaded to participate in this predetermined order of the necessity of the eternal substance. So we address, when we dialogue with others about the narrative of prophecy and the narrative of parable, we are doing a topical investigation or a topical unveiling of 4 categorical headings: fortune, assistance, direction, election. Just remember fade. Categorical, topical investigation under fortune, assistance, direction, and election. But through dialogue and through investigating the narrative of prophecy and the narrative of parable, through dialogue with others, we begin to really do some gold refinery work of understanding the primary attributes of fortune, assistance, direction, and election, and understanding the sub-concepts that fall under those 4 categories. We start getting a very good picture of the primary categories of Spinoza's system of substance. And this is the first time, he didn't mention this in his logic, this is the first time he mentions these four major categories in his system. So we begin our categorical work at the level of a dialogue within the realm of psyche as an unveiling of four major categorical areas, but we will pick up some sub-concepts too. Now after we do this, after we emerge out of this dialogue, we get involved in that work in the ethics where we articulate our own notion of extension, the notion of the extension of substance, what Hegel called the notion of the true. Well, the notion of the true for Spinoza is the notion of extension. But when you consider the narrative of prophecy and the narrative of parable, it is called something else. It's called what Spinoza says, we narrate the notion of divine law. So it's going to change as far as the way he names it. It's no longer the notion of extension when we address the specific intent of narrative. Well, the specific intent of narrative is always moral, and it's always an articulation of virtue. So now we want to articulate the notion of divine law, and the notion of divine law is an articulation of that which is right and good alone in its own self. It's an articulation of covenant, and it does take up those categories that were unveiled in dialogue. It does have a goal to achieve a better spiritual existence, and it will take up the law of association and the law of causation in order to track the interrelated form of these categories. And it will articulate, as a notion of divine law, we are articulating a structural rule. It's a generic structural rule for living, which is articulated by the self for the community of selves. So it is what Spinoza says here, narrative speaks to rule for living. So it is really starting to lean toward the ethics. The notion of extension now becomes the notion of rule for living. And it will address preservation for life. And it will address liberation for a true epistemological love of God as a quest to reach the level of gnosis, beyond the level of Sophia, the level of cognitive gnosis. And it will include the persuasive side of the level of psyche, which addresses more of the emotive. It's not going to be strictly conceptual, because behind the concepts are those narrative signs, and the narrative signs were always emotional in character. We don't evacuate the emotional. That persuasive content is included, and it becomes the empowering of the posited divine law. So now it's not simply the notion of extension. It's not simply an ontology. Instead, it's a quest for spirit. It's a rule for living. Now we're articulating something more than an ontology. We're actually positing an existential ontology, an ontology asking for involvement, for existential risk, for existential decisions. So it becomes much more a rule for living. But it's still generic. It's at the level of notion. It does take up those four categories that we're evolving at the level of the dialogue threshold. But like the ethics, like the logic, and then we're on our way to the ethics, Spinoza says we got to put it into the real society. We got to put it into the real world. It can't remain notion. It can't remain a generic notion of the rule for living, even though that's existentially powerful. It has to be put into practice, or the word we use now, praxis, action and reflection within a particular history. So when we put this into practice, he says that we will posit our own sign-like narrative. We begin the process of writing. We posit a sign-like narrative, not concepts, but signs that evolve out of our conceptual notion. We still remain on the level of understanding. It is cognitive work. We posit signs under the generic concept of the love of God. It's a two-part methodology involving philosophical reasoning. He elevates the work of philosophy, and it involves a dialectic of being dialectically involved with others in writing a narrative that relates to a specific history. So we're going to evolve from an understanding through reason to an understanding through narrative, according to Spinoza. Now we get involved in dialectical narrative writing. That's how we become practical. Being practical means to educate, and we educate by writing a practical historical narrative that can relate to the people within our own particular social situation. So we have that notion of the divine law, but then we're involved in this work of narrative and dialectic, which is going to posit that divine law through signs that point rather than frozen concepts, and that will lead to what Spinoza calls human law, and human law is a true expression of the epistemological love of God. That's human law. It's at the level of signs. It becomes our written narrative, which he calls the blessedness of the true intellect of substance. We reach that ultimate level, and that is we start living in that realm of the epistemological love of God through responsible interpretation of narrative in prophecy and parable, and then responsible writing of our own, where we write a new phraseology of providence as a necessity of substance and not superstition. And so what I'm going to do, just to wrap it up, I'm going to read the 6 intellectual instruments and the corresponding work of divine and human law from this text. Okay, number 1, the clear and distinct ideas corresponded to the initial prophetic voice of narrative and the mind of God as narrative in prophecy and parable. The second instrument of sufficient order is going to equal that partitioning we did of the prophetic voice into existential voice of the divine law. The third instrument of universal concepts is going to correspond to the unveiling of the unforeseen aspects of fortune, assistance, direction, election. First time for Spinoza to mention the 4 major categories of his system. So that's a big step for him in this text. The fourth instrument of the notion of extension becomes the notion of the rule for living from the definitions gained from that dialogue of Fade. And then the fifth instrument of the positive functional signs becomes, for us, the proving of our notion of divine law through a dialectic of experience that wants to prove that divine law through the positing of signs of human law. So we get involved in the writing of a narrative through our dialectic, which becomes the corresponding to the instrument of infinite intellect, where we write an actual phraseology of providence from our interpretation of prophecy and parable, coupled with our own acquisition of clear and distinct ideas in our own finite social reality. So he very much builds on the logic, anticipates the ethics, and in doing so introduces 4 major categories for the very first time of fortune, assistance, direction, and election. So he really starts unveiling his system here, and lets us know that we're not just going to be building notions of an ontology, but it's going to have existential importance. It's going to be involved in positing a true epistemological love of God. And in that way, we will write new narratives of our own